First of all, I want to introduce, sitting here next to me is the next discussion panel with John Battelle, who is possibly one of the most experienced, successful digital entrepreneurs and journalists around. And next to him is Ev Williams, a legend in Silicon Valley, a founder of Blogger and Twitter, and now the CEO of Medium. Before we get to their discussion, and the reason why we wanted to have this discussion is that underlying a lot of our discussions has been the development of a new form of communication of our information and our reporting, which we call the web or the internet. And it's everywhere, and it's changed a lot since the last time the Supreme Court ruled on it in 1997. It's no longer just, as it was described then, a form of print. It's the way we all get our information, and it includes, obviously, video, broadcasting, and so on. The question, obviously, is how do we bring it under some kind of control so it gives potentially preference to the public interest or to those who control it, the 4 or 5 companies that are the major platforms on the internet? How does it serve the public interest and provide information in some way that aids the public and helps public education and understanding, as opposed to treating fake news and news that may have reliable reporting behind it, fact-checking, et cetera? Could that happen? Is there some way to deal with that? So, being here in academia, what do we think of? We think of history. We think of things, explaining things that are going on today that may meet that criteria. For example, does anyone here know why 60 Minutes is on at 7 o'clock on Sunday? Federal Communications Commission regulation on broadcasting that says that between 7 and 10 o'clock on Sundays, that's prime time on Sundays, there has to be at least 1 hour of public interest broadcasting. That's why 60 Minutes wound up there in 1973, because in the 5 years that it existed before then, its ratings were infinitesimal. That was the secret to its success and its secret to decades of ratings in the top 10. And inside 60 Minutes, when I was there would be this discussion about why are we in the top 10? Answer, we're on 7 o'clock on Sundays. So, but we can't do that apparently today. But in any case, maybe we can, maybe we can't. To answer that question, to go back in history, there was nearly, is it over 50 years ago? Over 50 years ago, our mystery guest tackled that problem. The problem of new technology that had outrun public policy and the law. And so I'm going to introduce you to him right now, if this works. There he is, live from Chicago, Newton Minow. Then John F. Kennedy's commissioner, chief of the Federal Communications Commission, who, and Newt, do you hear me? What sound, can we hear him? Okay, let's do a sound test. Tell us what you said to the National Association of Broadcasters in 1961.
Well, television was pretty new in 1961, and I happen to be a television junkie. I watch television, I love television, and I was very disappointed at that time. There was very little, if any, program for children.
Okay, hold 1 second. If it can go wrong, Newt, in television, it's going wrong now. Your sound is breaking up, so what do we do? Try speaking a little slower, Newt, and we'll see. I'm told. Go ahead.
There was...
Oh, your wife's in the shot. Okay.
There was a little, if any, programming for children. The newscasts were sporadic, were 16 minutes long. There was very little choice. Cable really didn't exist in any substance. There were no satellites. But the technology was nowhere near the advanced. There was also very little public, very little commercial stuff.
We're going to try something here because we're getting some kind of
Okay,
feedback.
now
Now try it. No, he can't hear me though.
Now talk.
I said the last thing I said, there was very little public television. There was very little non-commercial television. The choice was very limited for the American people. There were 2.5 commercial networks, and that was about it.
And what was the quality of the television or the quality of the broadcasting that you saw, that you observed?
Well, some of it was extraordinarily good, but for the most part, there were too many commercials that were too loud. There were an excessive amount of violence. The problems existed the solution was a gun, and the impact, particularly on children, was what was bothering me the most, plus a very big absence of news programming.
So, you called it what, Newt, at that time?
Well, I called it, words I use it, I didn't pay any attention to the term at the time. I called it a vast wasteland. And those 2 words, I'm afraid, will be on my tombstone.
So, when you look at the internet today, a new technology that has, in a sense, exists without the proper public policy yet in place or any legal restraints, what do you see?
Well, what has happened, and you mentioned it earlier, but I want to underline it and repeat it. Technology moves much faster than public policy, and we want technology to move faster. We encourage it. Innovation, technology are what built our society and built our country. But at the same time, any thought about how the public interest can be served is forgotten. And in the case of television, that's what happened. If we had thought really about television as it was beginning, I think we would have had a different set of rules. Second thing is, technology changes the Constitution. Technology, for example, for many years, gave the president easy access to television, but not the Congress. And as a result, presidential power soon outstripped Congress. Television changed the Constitution by changing the boundaries. Our traditional state and local boundaries were set centuries ago. Television signals have no respect for city, county, or state boundaries. So the television industry and the advertising industry drew a new map of the United States that corresponded with television signals. They called them 158 markets. That was a fundamental change, not by the Congress, not by public officials. It was changed through technology.
And so what's the danger of electronic media for a democracy as opposed to print? What's the power of it that makes it so different?
There's a very interesting, very important case pending right now at the United States Supreme Court. The state of North Carolina passed a law, a state law, that said that anyone who had been convicted of a sexual crime would no longer have access to social media. This was, I underline, this was the government, the state saying this. This is now pending. The argument was in the United States Supreme Court last month. The issue is there a constitutional right to have access to Twitter or to Facebook or whatever, or can that be limited? Now, in this case, it was the state, and the argument is that because it was a governmental restriction, violated the First Amendment. First Amendment does not apply to the private sector. The people who own Twitter or who own Facebook are not bound by the First Amendment. They can make judgments of who has access to television without regard to the law. These issues, I think, are going to be debated. The argument that everyone should have access is that the internet has become the public square. It's become the place where all public debate and public discussion occurs. So you're going to see cases in court, arguments in Congress. You're going to see a lot of arguments at the Federal Communications Commission about what's called network neutrality. All this stuff is going to be played out, and we're going to try to, I hope, call upon the leaders in the tech industry, the leaders, to have a social conscience as well as an interest in the stock price.
But I just want to go back, one more little history lesson. So you were able to impose, or the commission was able to impose regulations so that an individual who was, let's say, attacked personally on the air, or if there were 10 candidates running for office, that there were ways in which you could regulate speech. You could force, if someone was attacked directly on the air, time for that person to reply, or for different points of view to be expressed, in an effort basically to have a more vibrant democracy and a more fair exchange of ideas, right?
That was called the Fairness Doctrine. It long preceded me. It had been in the at the FCC and in the law for decades, and we enforced it. There's also, of course, the equal time law in politics, where any candidate first has access to the air, and second is entitled to time to the equal time to his opponents. So you've got two interventions there by the government to be sure that there was fairness. Now, the Fairness Doctrine, however, disappeared by acts of Congress and the FCC, and that's no longer the case. And I think that's a very sad thing.
Well, that's been true, I think, since 1985, right?
Right.
Right. So today, there is no authority like the FCC that can regulate speech, right, on the internet.
That's right, and it's the Wild West. In some ways, that's good because we value freedom more than anything else. But in some ways, it's bad, particularly for kids, and particularly for fake news. This incident where someone was very proud to say that a pizza parlor, I think in Ohio, was abusing children. And somebody believed it and went in with guns and killed people. So there's got to be much further attention to how we make things more fair and at the same time preserve freedom. There are a lot of dilemmas involved.
So before I leave you, let me ask you a question that possibly our guests here can grapple with. What would you do about this problem today, about people with fake news or personal attacks on the air, and basically endangering democratic speech in this country?
Look, first of all, to the people who control the new media and ask them to do a better job of seeing to it that fairness and public interest are remembered, which unfortunately today are very often forgotten.
Okay, so now we're going to let you listen to them. I'm going to move this, and they're going to move me away, and you can hear John Battelle and Ev Williams, and maybe we'll come back to you at the end.
This is not at all daunting that Newton Minow is staring at us. You know, like a Google Hangout with Newt here. But if you're cool with it, Ev, I'm cool with it.
I guess we got to roll with it at this point.
Just as some context, I mean, there was some pretty heavy stuff that was just framed out there. Ev is one of the owners of Twitter. still on the board of Twitter and one of the co-founders, and Twitter is certainly one of the major players in the current conversation around, how we have public discourse in this country and around the world. And also started kind of what I consider to be the seminal social media company that everyone's forgotten, which is Blogger, which was the first place where you could, no matter who you were, hang out a shingle and say whatever you wanted to say. You don't have anything to do with Facebook, and Ev doesn't speak for Facebook, nor does he necessarily speak against it, although I've heard him speak against it publicly, so I might ask you about that. But given what you just heard from Newton Minow, what's your take on that? Do the platforms have a responsibility to surface high-quality public discourse through their private networks that they can control?
I think they have a lot of reason to. Responsibility is a hard thing to grapple with. I think there's responsibility if you think with great power comes great responsibility. If you believe that to be true, which I tend to believe, then there's maybe a moral responsibility to take that seriously. And from what I know of all the people who do make these decisions in these companies, they do, feel a lot of responsibility about that. They also feel a lot of responsibility to shareholders and employees, and I think that's the thing that we don't realize enough. It's not just like they're making up these rules or lack of rules, and it would be easy to change those rules. There are very strong gravitational forces that create these systems, and once they gain critical mass, then it's not easy to change them.
Right. So in other words, if I understand this, you and I have spoken before about platforms and how they have these feedback loops that become extremely strong. People, for example, with the Facebook news feed, get used to seeing certain things. The algorithms notice that and they strengthen them. This is what Eli Parser calls a filter bubble, right. But Mark Zuckerberg might call a really good business, right? And it was those feedback loops that have been called heavily into question because they were manipulated during not only last year's election, but during other elections and the current elections that are going on. That's what you're referring to in terms of these are hard to change once they get going?
They're hard to change. They're easy to change at the edges. They're hard to change fundamentally. And I mean, the way I think is helpful to understand platforms is if you've created a successful platform, you've created a successful system of feedback loops in which, which gets bigger over time. And there are many, many players usually on these platforms. And then there's the platform owner who is setting the rules. But those rules, and as well as perhaps luck and early adoption and timing and lots of other things, are what determine whether or not the thing was successful. And so the filter bubble is one effect of certain types of rules where more things get reinforced that you like. But there are all kinds of other rules that make these systems great. And if you get those rules wrong, not only are there bad effects, maybe everyone will stop using the product or it stops growing. So most of the work that goes on inside these companies is to tweak the rules or the system to make it grow more. And that's the strongest force that the people who build these things are dealing with, to make it grow more and to make it make more money.
Right.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. That's what creates the power.
Right. But then again, I think it strikes me that what we're kind of running straight into here is that we have, a big open public, square, which is the web. But increasingly that public square is dominated in terms of attention and dollars in the United States and in sort of the Western world by 5 companies, that are kind of outsized and growing extremely rapidly. I think 99% of all growth in digital publishing goes to Google and Facebook. Right. And which makes it extremely hard for the work of the folks here in this room to find distribution because for whatever reason, if you write something serious and long or shoot something serious and long, the chances of it doing well on Facebook are low. The chances that Google will surface it over something else that might, algorithmize for more clicks is low. Getting back to this idea of public discourse and the public interest, do you think, maybe personally, that there is a responsibility either of the government and or the companies to balance out those powerful force feedback loops with, I don't know, if it kind of feels like, eat your vegetables maybe, but it's really like, no, we need to have a conversation about important things in this society, and this has become where people have the conversation. However, it is a private network.
Right.
But there isn't really, other than, PBS, which our current administration has threatened to completely defund, we don't have a public place for discourse anymore.
Well, we don't. I mean, there are plenty of them. I mean, you can have public discourse on Facebook and Twitter and lots of other nooks and crannies of the internet. It's a matter of, do people choose to opt in? I mean, I think the defense of all these systems would be people choose to opt in whatever discussion they choose to click on. They can go straight to all the fine publications that the people in this, they don't have to go through Facebook.
Right.
And so I realize that's a dilemma still, but I think just speaking in defense of the platforms, I mean, I think they try to do smart things, but about, like, we want people to say, I think in their hearts, probably the leaders of these companies want people to consume good things. Just like if you have children, you want them, you give them food and you give them the pizza and the broccoli, and they eat the pizza first, and you're like, please eat some broccoli too, to pick up on your analogy. But so the broccoli needs to exist, and we need to eat more of it. And maybe sometimes we don't serve the pizza if we have direct control. But once people are adults, we kind of throw up our arms, and some people are going to opt into that. I think that's the thing. If you do value the freedom, you have to. There is a lot of good information on the internet. I think the business models to support it are the things that are maybe a more fundamental problem than the distribution problem.
Right.
They're intimately tied together.
We're going to get into that
Okay.
and in a minute. But before we do, I want to ask you specifically about Twitter, a couple of things specifically about Twitter. You co-founded it, you ran it for a stretch of time. It was kind of an extraordinary growth story. And then our current president got his hands on it. It's probably not surprising, and I know you're, as a director of the company, of public company, not allowed to make forward-looking statements, but we can look back. Twitter wasn't growing its user base very strongly over the past couple of years or 18 months, and that was something that the Wall Street analysts really beat you up for. And while the economy didn't get a Trump bump last quarter, Twitter did. It grew very, very strongly for the first time in quite a while. Do you attribute that in any way to the sort of manic tweets of our current sitting president?
There are people at Twitter who have definitely looked at this question.
Yeah.
At the same time that's happened, there's been a lot of very hardworking people tweaking
Right.
the system and making it better. So I don't think there's no evidence I've seen that the growth is primarily affected by Trump himself. What would seem believable to me is, in knowing Medium's numbers intimately and talking to a lot of people in the professions that we're all in, is people are just spending a hell of a lot of time consuming news and information.
Right.
In a way, I don't know if that's been quantified across the board, but of the type that Twitter deals in, it's like, oh my God, this thing happened right now. There's more of that.
There's
oh
a
my
lot of that
God,
going on right
this
now.
happened right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that we used to say this a long time ago. When every time something happened in the world, basically Twitter spiked.
Right.
And it used to be when we were small that it would be, and a Steve Jobs keynote would bring Twitter down.
Right.
And there's these points in history where something that everybody talks about, basically a news event, would be a huge event for Twitter, and we came to believe and realize as long as things are happening in the world, good or bad, it was good for Twitter. And now more things are happening, and so I think that's
Yeah.
resulting in growth.
Yeah. Twitter, as well as a lot of other social networks, but Twitter in particular has been, it's a nervous system for discourse, for conversation, but it also has had a real struggle with trolling, with abuse. How do you look at that problem, and has the company and of other companies done enough to address it? Because there is that fine line between the right to say whatever's on your mind, and the responsibility to ensure people aren't being physically threatened or harassed.
Yeah, I think we haven't done enough to address it historically. I think that's something that the leadership of the company has acknowledged. Jack has acknowledged that. Dick acknowledged that, the CEO before him. I would say that, the CEO before both of them, I definitely wasn't tuned into it enough. I think none of us were thinking about that as much. And now there's a tremendous amount of effort, as of very recently, especially being focused on that at Twitter. You can see a lot of moves we've made, and it's helping. We think we're measuring this carefully. It's later than it should be, for sure, but I think we're getting a little bit of a handle on it. And I think to give some perspective on that, I would say those of us who were early involved in the web, and I think we were just naive to this problem, basically. And we saw the internet as a different place than the rest of the world. And in the early days, everybody's cool on the internet. And so, you don't have, it's like a neighborhood where you don't have to lock your doors. And you say hi to everybody on the street and have good conversations. And then the internet became like the rest of the world, and in some ways worse, because people can hide behind anonymity. And, so some bad actors will thrive in that environment. And it took us a long time, and I think it will still take a long time, to basically realize, just like the real world, we need security on the internet. And we got wise to that about, security, like locking down your information, although that's still a bigger mess than ever. But I think it applies to people's security when it comes to abuse and harassment. And I look at all these systems, they're designed, the things that have made that a problem on Twitter are basically by design, because
it's designed to be open. It's designed to be anonymous.
Open. It was everybody can talk to everybody. How awesome would it be if everybody could talk to everybody, was basically our thought.
Right.
And it turned out it's kind of awesome and kind of not. So let's get more sophisticated about that. And so that's where we're at now, and I think we can make it better.
Do you worry about? I don't think you need to worry about it in the next 3 years and 265 days, not that I'm counting. But do you worry about the government sort of swinging Newton Minow's way and saying, okay, cowboy, we're coming in here, we're cleaning up the Wild West, it's time to make it safe for school kids. Here's what you can talk about, here's what you can't talk about, here are the regulations we're laying down?
I don't really worry about it. I think in some ways it could be good. And which I wouldn't have said most of my career. If the rules were well designed, and I don't know what those rules would be, that's an incredibly complex question. But I wouldn't rule out having some regulation. Yeah. I think the big worry, and I think the big assumption most people in Silicon Valley, most technologists would have, is the people who make those rules have no idea how these systems work, so the chance of them being practical rules seems slim.
Right.
But that's a more practical argument. From a philosophical standpoint, I'm not completely against regulation for powerful.
It strikes me that when you have, major state actors who are considered enemies of the country, leveraging vulnerabilities in private networks like Facebook and Twitter to potentially, allegedly, change the outcome of an election. That's the point at which the government might perk up its ears and start to think about that. Facebook responded to this publicly just very recently, and they're standing up an intelligence ops bureau, which is modeled after the national security apparatus. When a private company with the power of Facebook has an intelligence ops apparatus, it just makes me a tiny bit nervous. Does that make, I mean, when you heard that, did you go, huh?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the thing that makes me nervous, and probably should make everyone nervous, is just any entity, privately owned entity with that much power. So the fact they have an intelligence apparatus, maybe that's good because there are, foreign actors trying to attack our systems and our minds. So yeah, let's have, I trust the people who are in charge of Facebook's intelligence apparatus more than I trust the Russian government. So if I assume they're not, collaborating.
Right.
So
for now. Back to Twitter, and I gotta ask the easy one because it's fun. Twitter has an abuse policy. Our president has violated it. Should he be kicked off? I knew that would
I think the people who pay a lot of attention to this at Twitter would say he hasn't violated it.
Right.
And they spend all day parsing these rules. And the rules are somewhat by nature subjective. So I understand an argument where you could say he would. There are a lot of bad actors on Twitter, and Twitter kicks people off every day. And as Jack said, we would hold the same rules to the president and anyone else. And so according to our rules, we don't think he's violated it. He would probably get a warning first. I think we give
that
warnings.
That would be fun to do.
Yeah, but again, the rules are liberal on purpose, and so I don't know. It's an interesting argument though in general, and then an interesting discussion to say we could still kick him off. I mean, we're not.
Yeah,
We could if we thought that was the best thing for the world, and I've had that conversation with many people, and there are two sides to that. There are, well, yes, absolutely, obviously you should kick him off, or should have before he became president, and maybe he wouldn't have, or well, that's going to be his downfall, or we should at least see what crazy shit he's thinking.
Right.
So, leave him on, it's a tough call.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to Medium yet. Okay. But because I think that Newt might find this interesting because Newt's looking very engaged in. Just very quickly before we do that, the third kind of big consequential company that you started is Medium, and I remember sending you an email when I found out about it because I loved the name, because like Blogger was write as long as you want, and even if you shouldn't. Twitter was very, very short, and Medium's just sort of like, just right? Plus, it's a medium, right? It's got all this entendre. Tell us what your goal was with Medium and why you built it the way you did. It is clean, it is well lit, it doesn't have all the junk of advertising and pop-ups and container tags and all that stuff.
Sure. So actually my favorite definition of Medium is a conduit through which you do something. And so when I started Medium, which was 5 years ago-ish, most people who I knew, some said I liked the name, some said, so you're making a way so people can write on the web? Isn't that like a solved problem? And I did it for a bunch of reasons. And the main one was I thought that it goes back to these systems and the feedback loops. In my mind, before the term fake news was one I was aware of or I'd heard, I was very concerned with the quality of the information and ideas that we were all getting, and I thought there was a way to address that problem. I thought, the feedback loops are causing worse and worse stuff, and to be put in front of people, and people are consuming these things, and that's making us dumber instead of smarter. The internet is supposed to make us smarter. How could you change that? It seemed clear to me that platforms ultimately were going to rule. The point of there's 5 companies that control most of these things. I thought there's going to be more and more centralization because networks trend towards centralization. And if you look at the internet as a big network and it hosts all these other networks because of economies of scale and efficiency, the big get bigger. And so it seemed to me with publishing or media distribution in general, while it was being distributed on social media, it would eventually just be hosted on platforms because it was going to be more efficient. And that's what the internet, that's what all technologies do. They make everything more efficient. And so it seemed to me in the next few years, the majority of more substantive content that people are consuming, news articles, videos, etc., this stuff, that's not social media per se, but stuff you all do, was not just going to be put on websites and then pointed to by these systems. It was going to be published through platforms. And whoever won that, and I didn't think there'd be one winners, but I thought there would be, by definition, not hundreds of them. There would be a handful. If you could create a great system for that, you could define the feedback loops and you could reward quality. And so I set out to create a great system for substantive ideas and stories and create with feedback loops that actually rewarded good stuff.
Yeah. So Facebook, Google, and others, but let's just stay there, have tried with very little success to invite the work, this kind of work that you're talking about, onto their platforms. It has run directly into those feedback loops of business models, where I'm sure many of your organizations have deals with Google AMP and Facebook Instant Articles, and if you talk to the business side, they're like, I don't have any idea if this is working. I don't know. It's opaque. We're making like pennies. It's clear that it's not working right now. What could make it work? Because the business model question, I think, hangs over medium. How do we pay for this good work to be done?
Right. So the conclusion I've come to is people need to pay for good stuff.
This is a recent decision of yours.
Yeah. People need to pay. It's true in every other area of our lives unless the government is paying for it or philanthropy is paying for it. Corporations whose purpose is to drive their marketing message, paying for the ideas and information that direct how we understand the world, that's a bad deal. And it's bad for society, it's bad for quality, it's bad for truth, and that's what underlies all these systems. So what I'm trying to do now is create a platform that is has great stuff and it's paid for by people.
Yeah. All right. So like, Mr. Minow, do you have a question for Ev?
Question I have is, does anybody have a right to be on social media?
People have a right to be on social media.
I don't have a strong point of view on that. What do you think, John?
I think they absolutely do have a right to be on social media. As a matter of fact, in my work with The Last Mile, which is a program in San Quentin and down in Los Angeles as well, one of the things that was most extraordinary when I went in there for the first time was to learn that none of the prisoners had access to the internet. And many of the lifers who'd been there for 10, 20, 30 years, they'd hear about the internet on they'd watch Entertainment Tonight on television, and they knew it existed, but they had never been on it. And to think that we added that punishment on top of the isolation and all the other punishments of prison, that they, when they got out, had no idea how to exist in the modern world, struck me as cruel and unusual.
I buy that. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm curious what you think.
Well, I think this is one of the great dilemmas. Do you think, let's go back to the North Carolina case pending in the Supreme Court. Do you think that the person who is convicted of a sex crime can be denied access to social media to protect children?
I don't think you answered the question.
Yeah, you didn't answer.
Just tossed it back.
I don't really feel good grilling Newton Minow, but on the other hand, the one thing, one of my founding editors at Wired, Kevin Kelly, used to say, if it can be solved by technology, we should just get on with it. You know, someone who might act in a predatory fashion on social media because they happen to have a sex crime in their past could be caught acting in a predatory way by very simple technological, surveillance. And if that's the cost of allowing someone to have a political opinion and engage on Twitter, or to have a friend set and engage on Facebook and make sure that they see that their friends, got married or whatever else, it strikes me that you make a mistake, you shouldn't have to be cut out from life forever. And now this is life. I mean, just ask my teenagers. This is their life.
I totally agree, actually, and I think it touches on something and the abuse and lots of other things, and where I'm not a huge fan of the theory that everyone has to operate under their real name. I think there's lots of good reasons why they shouldn't. However, I think there's a difference between being able to have a voice and being able to be in front of, automatically have the attention of lots of people. And this is one of the challenges with Twitter, is that if you mention their name, you will show up even if you created your account yesterday and got kicked off 10 other times, although we have technology for that as well. And in the real world, there's such a thing as reputation. Right. And there's lots and lots of social signals, and reputation is something to be earned and lost. And we can replicate those systems. We have very primitive versions of that online, and I think it's very important for offline society that people care about their reputations and keeps them in check to some degree. And that is a thing that is addressable with technology.
Right. If there were, I don't know, Mr. Minow, if you've got another question, please.
Well, the other thing, in Europe, the law now contains what's called a right of reply. If someone feels that they've been attacked on the internet or told something that wasn't true, under the law in Europe, in most of the European countries, France, Germany, you have a right guaranteed by the law to respond. Do you think that'll ever happen in the United States?
Well, maybe if you write an op-ed about it.
You could post on Medium.
I was thinking that very thing.
Well, one of the beauties is you can reply. I guess I don't fully understand the law, because you can reply on the internet. It's two-way. I mean, that's one of the nice things about it. You're not necessarily going to be heard, is a challenge, but everybody can have a voice. I'll summarize. The key is having the same volume, and meaning the reply goes out to the same audience. That seems practically challenging, but it's interesting to think about who that would apply to and who it doesn't. I think there's cases where that would be really good, but then challenging.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to have you guys ask Ev questions. Looking back on Twitter, and bearing in mind what you said earlier, which is, there were many things when you guys built the original system, and maybe even a bit of naivete in just sort of saying, wouldn't it be cool if, right? Which is almost how the Valley works. Is it almost always these companies start with one question, which is, wouldn't it be cool if, ... And then they get huge. Is there anything you did in the early years at Twitter, or any decision you took that you would go back and change? And if so, what would it be?
On the product design side?
Well, just something consequential. I don't mean whether or not the bird was blue or red.
Well, the decisions that I would change are mostly on the, who controls the company side, but
Yeah, of course.
that's a whole nother area. I don't know if I would change. Okay, well, I think the biggest strategic mistake we made early on, product mistake, was around the API, which is a little complicated to go into, but from the very beginning, we built an API for Twitter basically because one of the engineers said, wouldn't it be cool if, and which basically meant that you could write software to easily get any data into and out of Twitter, which meant there was a proliferation of other companies and products, a few companies, many products that plugged into Twitter. And it was cool, but it wasn't a well-designed platform that actually gave benefits to users and to us and to those third-party companies, say like an operating system or the App Store, which is a platform where lots of things can be created and value can be added by all. And so we struggled with that for a long time, and some people built companies that then were in competition with us, and we had these awkward relationships, and we got a lot of bad press for eventually more or less shutting it down. And there are people even today who say, well, the reason Twitter didn't reach its growth potential is because we shut down the API, which I actually think is not true at all. I think the API actually didn't lead to meaningful growth. It led to a lot of geeky hype, basically, and it led to our actually a lack of growth because we spent so much time trying to maintain this infrastructure that all these sites were plugging into, that's where our time and money went instead of making the product better for a couple years. So we finally fixed that, but we let it go on too long.
Got it. Let's pull back. Questions, and where are the mics? We have mic on either side. Okay, let's start over here. The woman with her hand up.
Is it on?
Oh, all right. Hang on. Before we take the question. He wants to stay for a while. Newt wants to stay in. Well, I do want to just. We don't want to cut into his dinner. I don't want to cut into your dinner, and also we want to thank you for being part of this and look forward to an ongoing conversation with you about these topics.
I thank you for inviting me. It's very illuminating, and I think these questions will be the focus of a debate in our country, because these are very serious questions to answer.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Minow.
Thank you, Newt.
All right, question up here.
Yeah. So I had a question for Mr. Minow, but too bad, huh? Which was, anyway, the question is, you mentioned that you support regulation, but that people who make the rules don't really understand the intricacies of the business. So can you give a more concrete example of what you're talking about?
Not really, because it's all just hypothetical. I don't know I think that any regulation, it would depend on the regulation. I think it's clear from other things that have been proposed, and I don't have any great examples that the lawmakers in DC are not always totally savvy to how even the technology that they're regulating works. So that's the caveat to saying I'm supporting any regulation, is that there's a huge risk there that it would just be the wrong rules.
Over on this side, I don't know where the mic is, but, okay. Woman with her hand up in the second row there.
Hi. Oh, I'm Sierra Manning with the Center for Investigative Reporting with Reveal. I actually had a question about the diversity of Twitter. 26% of Black Black internet users use Twitter, whereas less than 20% of white and Latino people, I think, use internet users, use Twitter. And so I was wondering.
Is that a U.S. number?
That's just from what I saw from Mother Jones' story.
Okay.
Also from Pew from Pew Research. Anyway, so I was wondering, is it a priority of Twitter from the top down to increase the number of Black employees? Deborah Lee is the only Black person on your board, and your C-suite is bereft of Black people. So, just curious.
Good question. I think it is a priority to increase the number of Black employees for sure. We are and increase our diversity and inclusion across the board. I think we're aware of that issue. I know we have done a number of programs, and unfortunately, I'm not up to date on all of them right now. But I know it is an ongoing conversation. Has come up in board meetings and in the C-suite and at our shareholder meeting of a couple years ago, where we hosted Reverend Jackson, who gave a great talk on this subject, and so it is an ongoing discussion all the time at Twitter, as at Medium and lots of other Silicon Valley companies, but as you point out, particularly relevant at Twitter.
Matt Smith with CIR. I had another question for Newt, so I guess I have to ask you guys instead, begging your pardon.
Poor stand-in.
He mentioned the right for response. Europe also suffers from the idea of a right to be forgotten, which often means the right to erase the kinds of work people in this room do. Do either of you have any opinions about that? Would that be something you'd fight against, or is it something that you would be sensitive to because it's a privacy issue, or how does that strike you?
Yeah, I've looked at this. The right to be forgotten, I'm extremely supportive of it. However, not without some kind of, the technology actually has dealt with these kinds of issues in the past and is dealing with them again, which is you can't erase what is the public interest in the information that may be, quote, on the record that's being pulled off. And I think there needs to be traceability and accountability to that information. Otherwise, that right to be forgotten can be abused, particularly by corporations who have the rights of humans. So that would terrify me if it weren't properly, put into policy. But I have, and this is just personal, I have sympathy for people who feel like, they just want to get out of this, and people who write these great posts on Medium, which is the only place you find them really, about how hard it is to, un-Facebook yourself or un-Instagram yourself or pull yourself out of the ongoing machine that is Google in terms of our institutional memory. But it is extremely difficult from a policy standpoint, and so I'm kind of mixed on that right. We'll go down here if we could, one-on-one each side. I want to be geographically diverse.
I'm Ivan Handler. I'm an ex-chief information officer for Health and Human Services in Illinois. But the question I guess I have is, I'm concerned about regulation also because I think a lot of times in the internet it could backfire. In many ways, Google and Facebook and Twitter are kind of like monopolies, but the remedy for a monopoly is to break it up. You can't do that. But on the other hand,
I would argue you could ask Google to sell DoubleClick.
All right, so some of that maybe, but I think that the real issue on news is journalism is a profession. We understand what it means. There are professional organizations. And a lot, I think, of what's going on maybe with fake news is that, if there was just an easy way, which I don't think would be difficult to certify a source, the New York Times, this happens all the time, you know where you're getting your source. If you're seeing something that can't be sourced, that's interesting. Maybe if we can provide the public with the information it needs to make the right kinds of judgments, the rest of the stuff can be dealt with. The media, the New York Times can publish anything they want. If they get it wrong, they're going to get a lot of people on their case. It's going to, it kind of self-regulates. So I think maybe more of a transparency idea. There's problems with freelancers, which I think could also be solved, but some kind of certification methodology or something, at least when you get big enough, so that you can give the public some kind of confidence about what they're reading, but not censor them, not try to, not try to patronize them, which is what I think things go to. So I just want to know what your feelings would be about that.
I would just tweak that a little bit and suggest it's not about certification, or it goes back to reputation. And I think I think there's some interesting projects that are working on that, but philosophically, as an idea, someone, a trusted source, ranking the trust of other sources at the publication or the entity level, as well as the individual journalist, whether or not, and in that way, it's open for someone to be digging up facts and reporting them, even if they're a teenager in their basement, that's fine if they, over time, are able to build a reputation and are good at that, and then they want to protect that reputation. I think it's pretty crazy and pretty primitive right now that you can click off a link and you end up at some site, and it's, and 1,000 people may know that site's full of crap, and there's no way for you to know that. That's totally knowable, and another thing that we can address. I think that's an interesting avenue.
And these systems are now actually in place in Facebook. I think the question isn't, can you build a system like that? The question is, do you give it the energy of the feedback loops that Ev was talking about? And I think that's still an open question, because those systems not only have been built to some extent, but actually a really great piece on Medium that came out yesterday by the founder and creator of Google News about how to do it at scale. It's completely possible technically. The question is whether or not the companies will see it in their own best interest. Okay, over here.
John Dunbar, Center for Public Integrity, former FCC reporter, actually. I had a question for Newt, too, which was, does he think the internet should be regulated? Straight up. The Communications Act back in '35, not to blather on, but that's a public interest obligation that broadcast airwaves have, and cable companies and anybody who's regulated by the FCC. The internet doesn't have that public interest obligation. However, if you're a publicly traded internet company, you have a fiduciary obligation to the shareholders. My question is, if you were faced with a you should do the right thing question versus should you do the right thing by the shareholders question, wouldn't that put you in a tough spot?
Yeah. I think, well, going back to the Donald Trump question, I think there are those who have argued that if we were to remove Donald Trump and then the stock went down, that there would be retribution for that. But I think that's a tough line. I mean, I think you're allowed to exercise business judgment on all these things, and you can say we want to build a brand around. It could be a wrong bet, but I think you'd be pretty safe if you said we're going to be much more aggressive about fake news or anything else. And even if there's a short-term slump in growth because you've built your system off something else, I actually personally think that'd be a good long-term bet business-wise. And I think most things that I tend to be an optimist in creating these systems. I haven't really mentioned this part, but I think people are sick of consuming crap, and and they will opt for better alternatives as long as those better alternatives exist. And there will be systems, the existing systems that are hearing from their users, and lots of people want better information, just like there's cheap calories on every corner in the city, and I'm guessing most people in this room don't live off those. Occasionally, we all like some Doritos, but then we like a good meal that is nutritious and we feel better for it. I think the same thing applies, and there's demand for good stuff, and there will be people who build systems that cater to that. And that's one thing Medium's trying to do, but I think others will try to do. I think Google at least will lean that direction. They've always taken a very long look from going back to removing ads, even if they made more money, if people didn't end up, if there wasn't a quality signal, because they knew that people would trust the ads less over time. So I think we get smart about these systems and realize that if you take the long-term view, that's when the good for the people and the good for shareholders align.
Let's pick someone up in the quadrant. There's someone right next to you there in the first row with her hand up.
I'm Holly. I'm with KQED, which is public broadcasting. And sort of our currency is trust, right? And our business model is based on that. But my question is tying this back to the first panel of the day, which is when facts don't matter. It seems that there's an existential threat to sort of the work that the people in this room do, which may also be an existential threat to our type of democracy, which is that fact-based journalism that takes a long time and is thoughtful and maybe doesn't have a sensational headline to go with it, can't really compete with weaponized disinformation that knows how to game the algorithm and how to use data to reach people who are inclined to believe disinformation or warped information. And I don't know if taking the long view, I mean, it's sort of like we have this very big threat right now that may not be able to sort itself out via shareholders and society. And do you think that there's some sort of a technological answer to this, or is there a way to light a fire under the shareholders and the board members of technology companies to really say this might actually be a bigger problem than we are acknowledging?
Look, I think I share your concern and I share your urgency around these issues. I don't think there's a technological solution to, I think there is a technological solution to combating the worst of fake news. I actually think that's pretty trivial, and I think that's going to be done in the next year or two. I don't think there's a technological solution to cheap news, which I think is a bigger problem. I also don't think there's a technological solution that will make serious investigative journalism compete with entertainment when it comes to what people want to pay attention to. And so I'm still an optimist despite that. But I think that's where we land, and it's still going to be an incredibly hard problem. I think there's a business solution to competing with cheap news, which is, and I'm a little bit optimistic about this because I think the reason for cheap news, which is just basically what I call the stuff that isn't necessarily fake, but is not high quality and could be very misleading, and is giving people, most of that is driven by advertising revenue. The reason it exists. There are ideological reasons as well, and people create that stuff, but the Macedonian teenagers, obviously, that's fake, and that's pure for profit. And then there's the cheap stuff, which is just like, repurposing stuff, and it's all just trying to drive ad clicks. And I think that's going to be less and less effective as a business model, and a lot of it's going to go away, is my hope. And so I think it'll get less worse. Maybe we're at the peak of the crap, but it'll get slightly better, I think. But it's also consumer demand. I think there's a consciousness also that if the good solution would have existed, 3 years ago, I don't think people were as tuned in. They're still when processed foods just arrive, like it's amazing and delicious and it appeals to our base instincts, and until you get sick of it, you're going to keep consuming it. And I think a lot of people are sick of it now and they want something better, and that's why everybody who does charge money or takes money as donations has seen a lot more of it. That's to me a very encouraging sign. So I think things are going to get better from here.
All right, we have time for one more question. We have to go back
so
over to
many
this
hands.
quadrant, and if we can go up all the way to the back there. We haven't gone all the way back there yet.
Hi. Yeah. My question is, if we're talking about net neutrality and whether corporations have the right to charge people, for their access to the internet, can we also? I wrote it down. Should monopolies like Google and Twitter and Facebook have the right to control communication itself as much as they do? Like at a certain point, do they have the right to make these algorithms that present content a certain way and not present other content? And at a certain point, are they so powerful and do they influence speech so much that their effect on the public and free speech has to be regulated?
There were a couple questions in that question. One of them had to do with net neutrality, and another, I think the other one is the one that we wished we had asked Newt, which was, should the internet be regulated? I have a feeling, Lowell, you have an answer for the second one from Mr. Minow. Is that correct? Why don't you give us that answer, and then I might have something to say on net neutrality.
Is mic working? Okay. In a pre-interview, Newt said, and I'm trying to channel him, he said that, of course, it should be regulated. Will it be? No, there's not the political will to do it, and it isn't likely to happen very soon. So the only question is a public debate that forces the oligopoly that controls the internet to do something to prioritize information in the public interest. And he and I got in a discussion after that it was the pressure of the FCC. The fact, obvious thing that's missing is that you're not licensed. And so he was able, at the FCC, to squeeze the license holders and scare them. And that's why we got PBS. And the fear that they would be forced to do more. And so that was his answer. But he just told me on the phone, I thanked him for participating, that he wanted to emphasize to everybody that he thought that this discussion is vital to the future of the country, and particularly in influencing the private companies that basically control the internet, that there's really no political hope that there'll be regulation to bring this about.
Can I just throw something in? Oh, that means we're out of time.
Nope.
I think it's the television analogy is super interesting because obviously it was great that rule came into existence, and there's a lot of good, amazing programming and informational programming that came from it. But ultimately, it became an even more vast wasteland with cable and all these other options, and it recently got a lot better, not because of regulation, but because people started paying for good programming. And so the information you can get, recently became a lot better also because of there's serious reporting again, but in terms of entertainment, but also documentaries and all kinds of other very high quality programming on television, the best stuff is the stuff that's not ad driven. And that to me is a reason to be optimistic about the internet as well, because there is a demand for good stuff and people are willing to pay for it. And the television is about a decade ahead of the internet. And so even without the regulation, I think these systems that we want to regulate and that seem so powerful and seem like monopolies, I don't think are as secure as they seem. I don't think they're monopolies. I don't think they're going away anytime soon. But I think they are not going to be the only source of information because they're not that good. They'll either get a lot better or something will replace a lot of attention that is going to them. And so I think there is reason to be optimistic there, regulation or not.
I think the one thing about net neutrality that I'd bring up, because there was an earlier question about an example of a Washington policy that did not understand how technology cycles work. To me, first of all, as Robert Reich said in his last book, there's no such thing as an unregulated market. It's just a choice not to regulate that market is a regulatory choice. So the choice that the FCC recently made to unregulate net neutrality is a choice to allow very large companies to make decisions that will stifle innovation. And when Ev started Medium, if he were to do it in 2 years, the idea that he would have to pay to prioritize his packets so that people could get to Medium as fast as they might get to Netflix or to Google or to a large company that can afford that tax. That is a regulatory tax. It's just not called regulation. And that is, to me, not understanding how the Valley and how innovation works. You make a policy choice to allow the prioritization of packets and to destroy the principle of net neutrality. You are not understanding how innovation and new technologies emerge. So that's kind of my point of view on net neutrality. Let's keep it.
Yes, please.
And so with that, let's thank our panelists.